The sound wasn't loud. But in a silent penthouse filled with billionaires, the click of a gold watch hitting marble might as well have been a gunshot. Every conversation died instantly. A trembling waitress stood frozen in the center of the room, eyes glossy with humiliation. Across from her, Cha Sung-won, the most feared man in the city, stared at his empty wrist. Someone whispered near the champagne bar, barely audible. "Do you know who that belongs to?" And then his finger rose, slowly, deliberately, pointing straight at her. And that's when the doors to the private suite locked. He wasn't asking. He wasn't negotiating. He was accusing. Because when something valuable disappears in a room full of powerful people, suspicion never falls on the wealthy. It falls on the invisible. But tonight, Cha Sung-won is about to learn something dangerous. The enemy isn't the girl in the uniform. It's the woman wearing his last name. Stay with me, because the moment that watch is found will shatter more than a marriage. Zaraya arrived at the Grand Hotel 40 minutes before her shift started. She didn't mind the extra time. In fact, she needed it. Every dollar she earned at this job went straight to her mother's expensive medical bills and her little brother's school shoes. She tied her apron tight, tucked her hair under a neat white cap, and began her morning routine. While the other workers took long breaks in the basement, Zaraya was already scrubbing the marble floors until they shone like mirrors. She worked until her hands felt raw and red, but she never complained. To the wealthy guests, she was just a shadow in a clean uniform, a girl who moved quietly so they wouldn't have to notice her. The air in the lobby changed the moment the boss walked in. It wasn't a loud sound, but a feeling of heavy stillness that made everyone stop talking. Zaraya was polishing a brass railing near the private elevators when the heavy glass doors swung open. It was Sung-won. He moved with a calm, dangerous grace. He was surrounded by men in dark suits who looked like they were carved from gray stone. Zaraya kept her head down and focused on her work. She knew the rules: do not stare, do not speak, and do not get in the way of the man who owned the building. As he reached the elevator, the boss suddenly stopped. Zaraya froze, her polishing cloth held midair. She realized she was standing right in his path. A cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck. One of the guards stepped forward to roughly move her aside, but someone raised a single hand. The guard stopped instantly. Zaraya slowly looked up. For a brief second, her eyes met his. His gaze was sharp and dark, like looking into deep, cold water. She didn't see anger in his eyes, just a strange, quiet way of watching her. He looked at her worn-out shoes and then back at her face. "Excuse me, sir," Zaraya whispered. Her voice was very soft, barely louder than a breath. She quickly stepped back, pressing her back against the cold wall to give him plenty of space to pass. The boss didn't say a word. He simply gave a small, slow nod. It was a tiny gesture, but it felt like a sign of respect for the girl who worked so hard while everyone else just watched. He stepped into the elevator, and the silver doors slid shut with a soft chime. Zaraya breathed out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them to stay still. She had to get back to work. She could not afford to be distracted by a man who lived in a world of gold and secrets, even if she knew she would never forget the way he looked at her. The grand penthouse was filled with the sounds of a party in full swing. Beautiful women in silk dresses and men in expensive suits moved through the room, laughing and talking. Soft music played in the background, but it was almost drowned out by the clinking of crystal glasses. The air smelled of heavy perfume and rich food. Sung-won stood near the large glass windows, watching his guests with a calm face. He was the most powerful man in the city, and he liked everything to be perfect. The lights from the city below twinkled like tiny diamonds, matching the sparkle of the party inside. Sung-won reached down to adjust the cuff of his white shirt. As his fingers brushed his left arm, his heart skipped a beat. His wrist felt strange. It felt too light. He pulled back his sleeve, and his breath caught in his throat. The watch was gone. It wasn't just any watch. It was a rare piece worth over $1 million, a symbol of his family's power. The golden band and the shimmering diamonds that should have been there were missing. Only a faint, pale mark remained on his skin where the heavy watch had rested just an hour ago. His eyes turned cold and sharp. He didn't shout, but the people standing closest to him felt the change in the air. The relaxed smile left his face, replaced by a look of hard stone. He looked at his lead guard and gave a tiny, sharp nod toward his bare wrist. The guard's eyes widened in shock. He understood the silent command immediately. Without a word, the guard spoke into a small radio hidden in his sleeve. Within seconds, the heavy silver doors of the penthouse clicked shut with a loud, metallic thud. The music stopped abruptly, leaving the room in a scary silence. The guests looked around, confused and nervous. The exits were now blocked by men in black suits who stood as still as statues. The laughter died away, replaced by the sound of worried whispers. "Nobody leaves this floor," the head guard announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings and marble walls. Someone stood perfectly still in the center of the room. He scanned the faces of the rich guests and the busy staff members who were frozen in place. He thought about everyone who had come near him that evening. His mind flashed back to the quiet girl from earlier, the one who had stayed out of the way in the hallway. He didn't want to believe someone would be so brave or so foolish to steal from him, but the watch was gone. The party was over, and the lockdown had begun. The small, windowless room felt smaller with someone standing in it. Zariah sat on a hard wooden chair, her fingers digging into the fabric of her apron. The silence was heavy, like the air before a giant storm. Someone didn't yell. He didn't even move. He simply leaned against the heavy desk, his dark suit perfectly pressed, and stared at her. His presence felt like a weight pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. He looked at her not as a person, but as a puzzle he was about to break. "I remember you from the elevator," someone said. His voice was smooth and very quiet, which made it even scarier. "You seemed like a girl who worked hard. A girl who knew her place." He took a slow step toward her, his polished shoes clicking on the floor. "Where's my watch, Zariah?" "I don't have it, sir," Zariah whispered. She tried to keep her voice steady, but it shook like a leaf in the wind. "I was only cleaning the hallway. I never went near your room." Someone leaned closer, his shadow falling over her completely. He didn't blink. He stayed there, just inches away, using his silence to crush her spirit. He wanted her to feel small, and it was working. Zariah felt tears stinging her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She thought of her mother and her brother, and how this job was the only thing keeping them safe. If she lost this, she lost everything. In the corner of the room, Mina, Sungwon's wife, sat quietly in a velvet chair. She wore a beautiful silk dress that shimmered under the dim lights. She leaned forward, her face full of fake sadness. She looked like a concerned spouse who just wanted the truth, but her eyes were as cold as ice. "Oh, Sungwon, look at the poor girl," Mina said, her voice sounding like sweet honey. She walked over and placed a hand on Zariah's trembling shoulder. "She looks so scared. Maybe she just made a mistake? If you tell us where it is, dear, maybe my husband won't be so angry. We just want our family treasure back." Zariah looked from the powerful man to the beautiful woman. She felt trapped between two walls of a closing room. Mina's hand felt like lead on her shoulder, and Sungwon's gaze felt like a fire. They were waiting for her to break, waiting for a confession she couldn't give. Zariah took a deep breath, her heart thumping against her ribs. She was just a maid in a big hotel, but she knew she was innocent, even if the most powerful people in the city didn't believe her. The elevator doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the cold, gleaming expanse of the penthouse. Zariah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Before she could even take a breath, two of the security guards stepped forward. Their faces were like stone, showing no pity for the girl standing before them. "Empty your pockets," the taller guard commanded. His voice echoed off the high ceilings, making Zariah feel even smaller than she already was. Zariah's hands shook as she reached into her coat. She felt like a small animal trapped in a bright, expensive cage. One by one, she pulled out her meager things. Her house keys hit the white marble floor with a sharp metallic ring. Then came a crumpled bus ticket, a stick of gum, and her cracked cell phone. The guards didn't stop there. They grabbed her backpack, unzipping it with a violent tug. They didn't just look inside, they turned it upside down. Zariah watched in silence as her life was scattered across the floor. Her math notebook fell open, the pages fluttering like wounded wings. Pens rolled under the designer sofas, and a small, handmade keychain from her mother skidded toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Hey, be careful with that," Zariah whispered, her voice breaking. They ignored her. One guard ran his hands along the lining of her jacket, checking every seam for something she didn't have. The humiliation felt like a heavy weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She looked up and saw her reflection in the glass. She looked messy and completely out of place against the gold-trimmed walls and priceless art. They were looking for a thief, but all they found was a girl who worked hard and stayed quiet. Every inch of her clothes was patted down, and every pocket was turned inside out. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of the guards' heavy boots on the stone. Finally, they stepped back. The tall guard shook his head at the man standing by the door. "Nothing," he muttered, sounding almost disappointed that he hadn't caught her. Zariah knelt on the floor, her knees hitting the hard marble. Her eyes stung with hot, angry tears as she began to gather her scattered belongings. She tucked her torn notebook back into her bag and reached for the little keychain. It was all over and she was innocent, but the stain of their suspicion felt like it would never wash off. She was alone in the middle of all that wealth, and for the first time, the penthouse felt less like a dream and more like a nightmare. The guard who had searched Zariah stepped back, but the room did not feel any safer. A man named Mr. Han, who was someone's right-hand enforcer, stepped out from the deep shadows of the hallway. He did not look angry. He looked bored, which was much scarier to Zariah. He adjusted his dark silk tie and looked down at her as she huddled on the marble floor. "We found nothing on her person, sir," the guard reported, his voice echoing in the large room. Mr. Han let out a long, slow sigh. "That is because she is clever," he said, his voice as cold as ice. "A girl like this knows how to hide things. Searching her pockets is child's play. We need to be more aggressive if we want the truth." Zariah froze, her hand hovering over a pen she was trying to pick up. The stakes had suddenly changed. A moment ago, she was worried about losing her job and her reputation. Now, looking at the sharp glint in Mr. Han's eyes, she realized she was in real physical danger. The air in the penthouse felt thick and hard to swallow, like she was drowning while standing still. "Please," Zariah whispered, her voice trembling so hard it was barely a sound. "I told you, I didn't take anything. I've worked here for a year and never even touched a penny that wasn't mine. I just want to go home." Mr. Han stepped closer, his polished black shoes stopping just inches from her shaking hand. "The item we are looking for is worth more than your life, Zariah. If we have to break a few things to find it, including you, we will do what is necessary." Fear exploded in Zariah's chest. She dropped her bag and pressed her forehead against the cold, hard marble floor. This was her final plea. The tears she had been trying to hold back finally spilled over, splashing onto the white stone. "I am begging you," she sobbed, her whole body shaking with every word. "I have a mother who needs me. I am the only one she has. If you hurt me, you aren't finding a thief. You're just hurting an innocent person who has nothing. Please, look at me. Look at my hands. They are stained with cleaning supplies and hard work, not stolen gold. Don't do this. Please don't do this." For a second, the room was completely silent. Even the guards seemed to hold their breath as they looked at the girl on the floor. Zariah stayed bowed, her heart drumming against her ribs like a bird hitting the bars of a cage. She closed her eyes tight, waiting to see if her words would be enough to save her from the darkness that was closing in. Zariah remained on the floor, her shoulders shaking as she waited for what would happen next. The room felt like a giant machine that was about to crush her. Mr. Han stood over her, his long shadow stretching across the white marble like a dark stain. The air was thick with the smell of expensive flowers and the cold, sharp scent of her own fear. Someone paced back and forth, his face red with frustration. He was a man who hated losing things, and he hated waiting even more. He walked toward the glass table where his wife's belongings were piled up in a messy heap. In his anger, he swung his arm wide, his expensive sleeve catching a tall crystal glass filled with ice water. The glass tipped over with a loud crash. Water splashed across the table, soaking a pile of silk scarves and dripping onto the floor. It began to run toward his wife's expensive leather purse, which was sitting open near the edge of the table. Look at this mess. Someone shouted, his voice booming off the high ceiling. He reached out and grabbed the purse by its gold chain to pull it away from the spreading puddle. He didn't mean to look inside, he just wanted to save the leather from being ruined by the water. But as he lifted the heavy bag, it slipped from his wet fingers. The purse hit the table with a strange, heavy thud, a sound much deeper and louder than a lipstick or a wallet should make. Someone paused. He frowned and reached into the deep side pocket of the bag to make sure nothing had broken inside during the fall. His fingers brushed against something cold. Something hard. Something that felt like a tangled nest of heavy metal. Slowly, he pulled his hand out. Hanging from his fingers was the missing gold. The diamonds caught the light from the chandeliers, sending bright sparks dancing across the white walls. It hadn't been stolen by Zariah. It hadn't been hidden in the kitchen or the laundry. It had been sitting in his own wife's bag the entire time, tucked away and forgotten. The room went completely silent. The guards looked at the floor, and Mr. Han stepped back into the shadows, his face suddenly blank and empty. Someone stared at the gold in his hand, his mouth hanging open in shock. He looked at the jewelry, then down at Zariah, who was still kneeling in the water and the dust of her own life. The truth was finally out in the open. The girl they called a thief was innocent, and the gold was never really gone. Zariah looked up, her eyes red and puffy from crying, and saw the treasure dangling from his hand. The nightmare was over, but the pain of what they had done to her was only just beginning to sink in. The gold watch dangled from someone's fingers, swaying back and forth like a slow, heavy heartbeat. The metal caught the light of the chandeliers, sending bright sparks across the walls, but the room felt darker than ever before. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the drip-drip-drip of the spilled water falling from the edge of the marble table onto the floor. Someone's face, which had been bright red with anger just moments ago, suddenly turned a ghostly, pale white. The shift was bone-chilling. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. His hand began to tremble, not from rage this time, but from a deep, cold shock. He stared at the watch in his hand as if it were a poisonous snake that had just bitten him. He had been so sure Zariah was a thief, but the evidence of his mistake was now hanging right in front of his eyes. The silence of the penthouse was heavy and terrifying. The guards, who had been so ready to hurt Zariah, now looked at the floor. They were like statues of shame, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Mr. Han, the man who had suggested such cruel methods, stayed perfectly still in the shadows. The power in the room had shifted in a single heartbeat. The person who had been the hunter was now the one who looked caught. Someone looked down at Zariah. She was still on her knees, her face wet with tears and her hands covered in the dust from her own scattered life. The accuser was no longer a powerful man in a high tower. In that moment, he looked like a fool. He had screamed, he had threatened, and he had let his men humiliate an innocent girl, all for a watch that had been sitting right under his nose the whole time. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a dry croak. He looked at the watch, and then at the girl he had treated like a criminal. The pride he usually carried was gone, replaced by a look of total horror. He realized that he could not take back the last hour. He could not unscatter her things or erase the terror he had put in her eyes. The man who thought he owned everything finally realized there was one thing he could not buy back, the dignity he had stolen from the girl on the floor. Someone turned his head slowly toward his wife, Mina. She was standing by the large windows, her face as pale as the white marble floor. The necklace was still hanging from his fingers, a golden weight that felt like a hot coal in his hand. He did not look like a powerful boss anymore. He looked like a man who had been hit by a sudden, cold wave of truth. "Mina," he whispered, his voice cracking in the quiet room. "You said she took it. You told me you saw her near the jewelry box with your own eyes." Mina's perfect mask began to fall apart. She did not look at him. Instead, she stared at the expensive leather purse that had spilled its secrets across the table. Her hands moved to her throat, pulling at her silk scarf as if she were suddenly struggling to breathe. She looked like she was choking on her own lies. I needed the money, Sungwon," she stammered. Her voice was thin and shaky, nothing like the confident woman who had ordered Zariah around all morning. "I have debts. There are people you don't know about. They were coming for me. I was going to sell the necklace and say a thief took it. I didn't think you would actually call the guards and search her." Zariah watched from the floor, her heart still drumming against her ribs. The reason for all this pain was so small and greedy. Mina had a life filled with luxury, yet she was willing to let an innocent girl be destroyed just to cover up her own mistakes. It was a cold power play that had gone horribly wrong, and Zariah had been the one caught in the middle of it. Someone looked at the guards, then at Mr. Han, and finally back at Zariah. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He had almost let his men hurt a girl who had done nothing but work hard and stay quiet. He had almost ended a life because of his wife's betrayal. The anger that had been aimed at Zariah suddenly turned inward, turning into a deep, bone-chilling shame. "You lied," someone said, his voice growing deeper and more dangerous. "You sat there on that sofa and watched while they searched her. You watched her cry on the floor, and you didn't say a word to stop it." Mina let out a small, pathetic sob, but nobody moved to comfort her. The penthouse, which usually felt like a palace, now felt like a courtroom where the truth was finally being told. Someone closed his eyes for a second. The image of Zariah's terrified face burned into his mind. He had been the fool, and his wife had been the monster. He looked at Zariah again, seeing her for the first time not as a servant, but as a person he had deeply wronged. The penthouse grew suddenly still. Someone stood in the center of the room, his eyes dark and heavy. He looked at the guards who were still standing by the door, their hands ready for a fight that was no longer coming. "Leave us," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a command that made the air feel thin. "All of you, get out. Now." Mr. Han bowed his head and signaled for the men to follow. Mina tried to speak, her eyes red and her voice trembling, but someone pointed toward the hallway without even looking at her. Within seconds, the large, golden room became deathly quiet. The only sound left was the faint hum of the city wind hitting the thick glass windows. Zariah remained on the floor. Her fingers shook as she clutched the strap of her bag, trying to pull her life back together. She didn't look up until she heard the soft scuff of leather shoes on the marble. To her total shock, the powerful man did not stay standing. Slowly and stiffly, someone sank to his knees right in front of her. He did not look at her with love, and he did not look at her with kindness. His face was still stern, like a statue made of granite. However, his eyes held a deep sense of honor. In his world, a mistake like this was a stain on his name. He had treated an innocent person like an enemy, and his own laws demanded that he fix the balance. He was not kneeling because he was soft. He was kneeling because he was a man who followed his own dark rules. "I cannot take back the fear I put in your heart," he said. His voice was low and steady, echoing off the high ceilings. "I cannot unbreak the things that were tossed across this floor today." He reached into the inner pocket of his expensive suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, heavy envelope made of high-quality paper. He did not toss it to her or slide it across the floor. He held it out with both hands, offering it to her with the kind of respect usually saved for kings. Zariah hesitated, her breath catching in her throat, and then she slowly reached out to take it. When she peeked inside, her heart skipped a beat. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was enough to pay for her mother's hospital bills, a beautiful new home, and a future where she would never have to worry about a single cent. "This is not a tip," someone stated firmly, his eyes locking onto hers. "This is a debt. You will never have to wait tables again. You will never have to scrub a floor for a man like me ever again." Zariah looked at the envelope and then at the man kneeling before her. The terror of the morning was still there, but the heavy weight of being poor was suddenly lifted. Someone stood up and stepped aside, opening the clear path to the elevator. He did not ask for her to forgive him, but as the gold doors opened to take her away from that place forever, Zariah realized her life had changed in a single heartbeat. Zariah walked out of the penthouse with her head held high, though her heart was still pounding in her chest. The heavy envelope was tucked safely inside her bag, pressed against the notebook that had been scattered across the floor only an hour ago. When she reached the lobby, a driver in a dark suit was waiting for her. He opened the door of a sleek, black car and waited for her to step inside. As the car pulled away from the curb, Zariah looked out the window. The tall glass tower where she had spent so many hours scrubbing floors and polishing silver began to shrink. She looked at her hands. They were still red from the cleaning chemicals, but for the first time, they didn't feel tired. She realized that she would never have to return to that cold, golden cage. She was safe, she was finally wealthy, and her mother would never have to worry about medicine again. The city lights blurred as the car sped toward her neighborhood, carrying her into a brand new life. High above the street, the atmosphere in the penthouse had changed. The elevator reached the lobby, and the heavy doors of the apartment clicked shut with a sharp, final sound. The electronic locks turned with a soft beep. The outside world was gone, and the silence that remained was thick and terrifying. Someone stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window, watching the tiny red tail lights of Zariah's car disappear into the city traffic. He did not move for a very long time. His shadow stretched across the marble floor, reaching toward the spot where Zariah had been kneeling in tears. Mina stood near the sofa, her hands shaking as she tried to smooth her expensive silk dress. She looked at the back of her husband's head, searching for a sign of the man who used to buy her diamonds and flowers. She waited for him to turn around and tell her that everything was okay, but the silence only grew heavier. "Sungwon," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I told you I was sorry. I was just scared about the money I owed. We can just forget today happened. We can go to dinner and talk about something else." Sungwon turned around slowly. His face was no longer pale with shock, it was as hard as stone. He looked at his wife, but he didn't see the woman he had loved for years. He saw someone who had put his honor at risk and almost made him a monster who hurt an innocent girl. In his world, a lie was not just a mistake. A lie was a betrayal of the highest order. "The girl is gone," Sungwon said, his voice flat and cold. "Her debt is settled. I have paid for the pain we caused her. But now we have to talk about your debt, Mina." He walked toward the center of the room, his eyes never leaving hers. Mr. Han appeared from the hallway, standing silently behind Mina like a dark shadow. The luxury of the penthouse felt like a cold prison now. Mina's eyes widened as she realized that the man who had always protected her was no longer her shield. "In this house, every lie has a price," Sungwon stated. He didn't scream, and he didn't need to. He simply watched as the reality of her situation sank in. The sun began to set over the city, casting long, dark shadows across the marble floor. The penthouse was quiet, but it was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. The debt of the Mafia was a serious thing, and for Mina, the time had come to pay for her lies.